My guest today is Carl Rollyson for the second time, although we've talked many other times. Good morning, Carl. Thanks for
Good
joining.
morning, Karen.
We have a kind of an interesting twist today because I asked Carl. I have to give a talk at a library about the Thanks for Typing conference and the idea that came up it was soon after the Me Too movement. Um, about the women behind prominent men and all the ways in which their support and contributions hadn't been fully acknowledged or perhaps acknowledged at all. But you are an amazing expert on Sylvia Plath in particular, as well as you've written biographies of other women. But how many books have you written about Sylvia Plath?
Well, I've published 5, and there's one more on the way, and I'll probably stop there.
Okay. And you, because we talked
Although
about,
I'm writing a book now in which she does figure as well.
so you really are the person to talk to about this. And, you've changed my notions about her. She's someone who so a myth has grown up around her, and you've debunked that, and actually in not debunked in the sense of knocking someone off the pedestal, but actually showing us that there's more to her than a lot of people think. But this, because of the Thanks for Typing, um, one of the things that I had never considered until you made me think about it, and then I read in one of her. It must have been one of your books. A letter from Plath to one of her husband, Ted Hughes's friends, offering to type for
Mhm,
him. And I thought, what how extraordinary. So as I thought about Thanks for Typing, she came to mind again. So if you could, I mean, this is your show, but
mhm.
can you, for those who don't know Sylvia Plath, let alone her husband, Ted Hughes, and why we should also pay attention to him, could you introduce them? And then let's talk about how Sylvia Plath, as I rather think you've persuaded me, she to some extent made Ted Hughes.
Mhm. Well, I'll start by saying that Sylvia Plath was an excellent typist, and I'll explain that in a moment. She grew up in the Boston area. Her mother, when she was quite young, moved to Wellesley, thinking her daughter would attend Wellesley College. Her daughter was very precocious. She had her first poem published when she was 8 years old. Um, Eventually, Plath decided she wanted a different kind of experience away from home and went to Smith College. She was, from a very young age, a huge reader. Lots of biographies written for children about various famous figures, um, periods in history going back to the Middle Ages. She was very interested in all of that. At the same time, she was a kid, and she and her brother read comic books. She listened to this was the radio age in the 1940s. She listened to Superman on the radio. Um, she was very attracted to powerful male figures. Her father died when she was 8, and he had made
Oh,
quite
this
an im yeah, he made quite an impression on
yeah.
her, and she later wrote her famous poem, Daddy, which in part is about him, but it's also about Ted Hughes and other male, powerful authority figures, including Hitler. Actually, as a young girl, she was growing up during World War II. She, created a snowman figure of Hitler. I'm writing about that now for an article that will appear in Moment magazine about Plath's attitude toward Jews, and, I track all of the references in her life to Jews. So she, is a very ambitious young woman. Um, by the time she gets to college, she's saying things like, she doesn't put it this way, but essentially, I want it all. I want a
And
husband.
when was this? Am I right? She was born in 1932.
Yes, yeah. So she's
Yeah,
at Smith College in the early 1950s,
yeah.
and she's writing many, many letters home to her mother, but to other people as well. And is a very 1950s figure in the sense that she's saying things like, "I want a home and a family," like a lot of Smith
Mhm.
College girls did. She also said things like, "I don't want to be a career woman." At the
Oh.
very same, and she uses that phrase, career woman.
Mhm.
That's a
Mhm.
pejorative in her
Yes, it
view,
was quite yeah,
like
yeah.
spinster was in an earlier generation.
Mhm.
And she's at the same time saying she's doing a lot of dating. She has lots and lots of boyfriends.
Mhm.
One, in fact, is training to be a doctor. And he, to her mother, thinks like he's a really good prospect, but Plath
Yes, right.
eventually considers him to be boring. And one of the things she's worried about with this fellow, who's a few years older than her, is he gonna give me time to write? Am I gonna be sucked into some kind of marriage where I'm just taking care of the babies and the kids? And so she doesn't wanna be a career woman. On the other hand,
Mhm.
she's looking for a powerful male figure, and she'll often put it that way, someone who's a kinda
Mhm.
combination father-husband.
Uh-huh.
And she tries out all kinds of guys, tall ones, short ones, smart ones, some not quite so smart. She really does a lot of dating, a lot of looking around. Then she gets a Fulbright and she goes to Cambridge University
Mhm.
in England, and she's dating more boys there, mainly English boys. And she finds them not quite up to snuff. They're a little immature, she thinks.
Mhm. Mhm.
And, then she hears at the same time that he hears, the he being Ted Hughes, they hear about one another from mutual friends. And then they meet at a party, a very famous party and famous encounter in which he rips off one of her earrings and she bites him on the cheek. And it's a very, very intense kind of experience,
Very physical, very
very
physical.
physical experience,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
their lovemaking is very physical.
Mhm.
At this in the very early days, in 1956, she's still involved with an American, Richard Sassoon, who's
Mhm.
in France, and is very upset because he breaks off contact with her, even as she's getting to know Ted Hughes. But
Mhm.
Ted Hughes does constitute a kind of Superman figure for her, and he's got
Because what
this.
was he like?
He was
He was
tall.
tall,
She
yeah,
describes
and
him
she
as
was fairly
hulking. She was very
mhm.
tall.
Yeah.
Um, and, he's almost presented as a kind of dangerous figure. It's a
Mhm.
kind of she's watching the film Jean Cocteau's Beauty and the Beast. I
Mhm.
write about this in my last published Plath book, The Making of Sylvia Plath, and there's clearly a transference there between her idea of taming a beast, and civilizing him without
Mhm.
losing that sort of primordial energy that the
Mhm.
beast figure has.
Yeah.
Now, the thing about Ted Hughes is he's also a Cambridge graduate, but he's doing nothing with that degree.
Mhm.
He's a dilettante. He's looking at writing, trying to look at scripts for J. Arthur Rank in London. He's got this following, this male following, practically, you'd almost call them disciples. They're
Uh-huh.
so enamored of him, the men around him. And none of them, of course, quite measure up to Ted, but Ted, he's a very friendly chap. They
Mhm.
like him. He helps them out, etc. So he and Plath get more and more involved. It becomes more and more intense. She's a great admirer of his poetry. Hardly any of it has been published except in magazines, college
Mhm.
magazines, I should
Mhm.
say. Very
Mhm.
local
Mhm.
notoriety, so to speak.
Mhm.
He, at this point, he's got an older sister who he's very attached to, and she's very attached to him, Owen. And he has an older brother, Gerald, who's in Australia, who Ted was very close to, liked to go hunting with, and so on. And Ted at this point is not thinking about he's writing poetry, but also he's not a career girl, he's not a career anything. He's thinking of going to Australia, of emigrating, because he's not that happy with
Uh-huh,
England, which is Plath will say this too, rather complacent and cold and all kinds of
uh-huh,
things which he doesn't like. Well, uh, she reads his poetry, he reads hers, they criticize each other. They find that not intimidating, but, enlivening,
uh-huh,
exhilarating. She's finally found a guy who's both physically and mentally her match.
uh-huh,
And after several months, they do get married. And in those early days, he never says this, but it's clear she's pushing him, pushing him, pushing him. She, as I said, from the age of 8 was a published poet. She said at one point, I could line my rooms with rejection slips. She knows all about publishing. She knows where to submit poetry. She knows the whole mechanics of it. And as I said, she's a very good typist.
uh-huh,
And she types his poems. She does offer, I say this in the last days of Sylvia Plath and other of my Plath books, she does make that offer, as you say, to one of his friends to also type his poems.
uh-huh,
I don't think he took her up on it. I can't find any record that she actually
uh-huh,
typed poems from, but he never let on in her presence, but he didn't like her. Why didn't
uh-huh,
he like her? Because essentially he, like a number of the other males around Ted, felt she had taken him away from them.
uh-huh.
So this guy, this dilettante, who does obviously have promise, she's gotta whip this guy into shape.
And she marries him in the process. She doesn't
In the
wait till she's
process,
whipped him. She doesn't wait till
he's
she's
not done anything of any real note, but she keeps telling mother, "This guy's gonna be great." And
Mhm.
she writes to an editor in the States who she had a brief affair with also, "I just married this guy and he's gonna be great." That's essentially what she's telling everybody.
I'm gonna
So
make
she's
him great.
also she's also kind of, promoting him. She's
Yes.
she's like his agent.
Is that one of the things his friends didn't like? I mean, she was
Yes.
at approached literature in a different way. I mean, some
Yes.
people approach literature as it's yeah.
There's the anti-Americanism involved. She's this
Mhm.
pushy American, too outspoken, too aggressive. She's not like any of the British women they're
Mm.
used to dealing with. And, there's this residual, the Americans helped us out in the First World War, but they don't know the score sort of thing. Second World War, they
Yep.
don't know the
Yep.
score.
Yep. Yep.
There's a real lingering resentment there. So that's in the cultural background, so to speak.
Yes.
So here's what's really, incredible. Uh, Platt predicts, as I said, that Hughes is gonna be a great poet. She knows that Harper's Magazine has this contest for the first book of poetry by a poet. She, after having typed these poems, sends in the poem, Hawk in the Rain, the book of poems
Mhm.
that
Mhm.
Hughes writes, essentially predicting he's gonna win it. How could he not win this award? He's great.
And she what about her own poetry at this
Her
time?
own poetry, she feels, is not yet up to what his is. She feels her poetry is a little ladylike. It's
Uh-huh.
not the strong, fierce stuff, which she just begins to write after she marries him. She
Mm.
becomes much more of a vibrant poet, much more like the Sylvia Plath of the last poems. She's not there yet,
Mhm.
but she's moving in that direction.
Is
So
that his influence?
oh, yeah, I
So is
think
sh
oh, yeah, there's
yeah,
a
so
mutual influence, yeah.
yeah, so
There's
it's
she's
very
telling him
interesting.
he says to his
Mhm.
sister, for instance, in a letter, he said, she tells me when I go off the tracks. She's not afraid to tell
Mhm.
me when the poem isn't any good." And he said, "I do the same for her."
Uh-huh.
It's a very
Uh-huh.
close partnership, between
Uh-huh.
them at this point. There's a
Mhm.
biographer, Diane, Middlebrook, who's written a whole book about this, about the
Mhm.
mutuality that's going on here between the couple.
Yeah.
And it's unusual
Yeah.
too in that She may have had some jealousy or, certainly not resentment. Some, because he was very once he got started, he was very prolific.
Yeah.
She may have felt, not inferior exactly, but I haven't really gotten there yet, is sort of her
Mhm,
feeling, although
mhm,
she's thinks that she can, get to being a first-rate poet.
mhm.
So, they send this poetry off to the contest, and he wins. He wins the Harper's Prize, she gets an offer to teach at Smith after she finishes her Fulbright studies at Cambridge. And they actually spent some time in America. He has this big to-do at the, 92nd Street Y where all the big poets
Mhm.
went and where he's sort of celebrated and so on.
And this is she has typed his poems,
Oh, yeah.
organized them presumably, and shipped them off,
That's
figured
right.
out where to send them.
Yes, as I suggested before, he might very well have joined his brother Gerald in Australia, and we may never have
Yeah.
heard of Ted Hughes.
Yeah.
It's conceivable, we don't know. He might have
Yeah.
been a late starter, he may have decided
Mhm.
Australia wasn't for him. His life might have taken a different course. Nevertheless, there is just no it's obvious. She's the spark plug. She's the thing that gets
Mm.
him going.
Yeah. Yeah. Uh,
Absolutely.
Now, would you say, for those who don't know, Ted Hughes became the Poet Laureate of England. I mean, he became
That's something else
and
that she predicted.
did she?
Well, she
Where
didn't say poet laureate, but she said, "I'm gonna be the poetess of America, and he's gonna be the poet of England." Well, that's what the poet
Right.
laureate is.
Yes. So his trajectory, that was the beginning where her trajectory was very different. We'll get to that. But this idea that um she started him, but then let's hear 'cause then this interaction between them continued, but changed over the so they were married in 1956,
Mhm.
and she died of killed herself in 1963, so a fairly short period, but a very eventful few years there. So so what how did Ted Hughes react to his glory days? I mean, or at least what must have seemed,
Well,
quite
yeah,
astonishing, yeah.
it was astonishing, and she thought when she accepted the job at Smith, which she only did for a year because she, with somewhat under Hughes's influence, decided teaching just took up too much time. She had to devote all her time to
Mhm,
poetry. He, kinda took it in stride. He always wanted to say and there are lots of writers, English, American, other kinds of writers, who wanna believe it's just the writing, that's all that matters. In other words, the whole promotional bit and everything,
yes,
uh, isn't
yes,
isn't, that's not why I'm a great writer. It's not because of the reviews or because someone was pushing me or because I have an agent or these things. It's really the strength of my own work, and when he got to America, he hated it, and part of it what he hated is the idea that which was rife and always has been in American culture, that you have to sell yourself. Of
mhm,
course, there are American writers and just Americans in general who reject that ethos, but America is very much about the go-getter, about the
mhm,
idea of picking yourself up by your bootstraps and, promoting yourself and so on. And, Dale Carnegie, How to Win Friends and Influence People.
mhm.
And the
Which
curious
Sylvia Plath took to
well,
to
that's
heart.
why I like Plath, is that she was deadly serious, but she was also popular. That is, she wanted to be popular. She didn't wanna
Mhm,
see a contradiction between being popular and being a great writer, whether it
mhm,
was a novelist or a poet or whatever, essayist and so on. And Hughes had very much had these old world views, and couldn't wait to get back to England, even though when he left, he said, "England is done. It's
right.
finished. It's, they're still recovering from World War II. It's gray, literary society is incestuous. I'm going to go to America and things are going to open up for me, which they did to some extent. But boy, if you read his letters
Didn't
about the
like
United
it.
States, he did not like it. The only time he likes Northampton at all is when he sees a couple streets that look like England.
Mhm.
It's that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And one of the things that always it fascinates me to this day is Plath never deals with that. She never deals with his hostility to the United States. Now, to what extent he shared it with her, I don't know. It's hard to say because it's not in her journals. Ted says he doesn't like it here. She never
Mhm.
says anything like that. What she says when they move back to England is more opportunity. And in a strange way for poets, that was true.
Mhm.
Because not only did they have all the poetry journals, and of course there were some in America too, but I mean, this is the age before writers in residence, and that became a common
Mhm.
thing in the United States. And in England, they had the BBC.
Right, which became
BBC
very
Radio,
important.
a poet
Yes.
like Louis MacNeice, and then later Ted Hughes, actually were able to make not a fortune, but they were able to make a living as
Mhm.
poets. I mean, not very many of them, but Ted
Mhm.
was one of them.
Mhm.
And also, I should have
Mhm.
said, and Plath mentions this too, he had a tremendous voice. She was a
Uh-huh.
huge, huge fan of, what's his name, the Irish poet, Dylan Thomas.
Uh-huh.
Huge fan of Dylan Thomas. And she said Ted Hughes's voice was better than Dylan Thomas's. And when Hughes had his audition for BBC Radio,
Mhm.
he read other poets like Dylan Thomas, and eventually he
Mhm.
was reading his own poetry and writing plays for
Mhm.
radio and all sorts of things. He was a big, he became a big, big deal.
Mhm.
As we're going to get to, it took Plath. It was a struggle for her. It took her much longer, and she does begin by the time 1959, 1960. She's sometimes she's worried. She's worried
Uh-huh.
because it all comes to tell you. Even his dreams are wonderful. She thinks, why can't I have those? Why can't I have those dreams? She even writes a story about that. And the guy was just, he never suffered from writer's block. The only time he suffered from writer's block was when he was in the United States.
Uh-huh.
All the other times, God, I mean, he was just a whirlwind.
So he was putting out a lot of poetry, and what about her in
She
those
was
first
one of the
years of the
yeah,
marriage?
even in the first years of the marriage, she was published in Poetry Magazine. Eventually, after a couple years, she had a New Yorker reading contract. They had
Mhm.
first refusal on anything she submitted to them. So she was, you can be a very
She was
successful poet in in America as well as in England, and nobody knows who you are.
Mhm.
Um,
Now
and
did
so
she do the BBC? Because she had, of course, the Ameri
Eventually. Yeah,
yeah.
eventually when they moved back to England, by 1960, she is on the BBC.
Mhm.
And by 1962, shortly before she dies, she's being asked to, organize a program about American poetry at a British theater.
Mhm.
We have recordings of her reading on the BBC. Her voice also, by the way, changes. It becomes much more, Mid-Atlantic,
That happened to
less
me when I
less
lived there.
provincial,
Yeah.
her and she's tremendous, she does some acting, she could have been an
Uh-huh.
actress.
Uh-huh.
Her reading of her own poems is just fantastic, and
Mhm.
they're she said to the critic Alvarez, "These are poems to be read aloud," and she read her own poetry, and he
Mm.
published a lot of her in The Observer. So, in the last year of her life in particular, those are her greatest poems, and she knows it. She knows that it's great poetry, and maybe I'm skipping ahead too much, but most people do if they know anything about Sylvia Plath. Oh, they know that her husband left her. Actually,
Mhm.
she kicked him out of the house,
Mhm.
and she found her voice. She said that in one of her letters that it's a strange thing. On the one hand, she's bereft because they were supposed to be the poet of England, the
Perfect.
poetess of
Yeah,
America, and the
yeah.
perfect couple, and she can't quite get over that. On the other hand, God, it fuels the energy of her poetry is just, true. I was writing about a poem today because I'm writing a book about Sappho, and she
Mhm,
writes a poem called Lesbos. And
mhm.
what's interesting about that, I won't we're not supposed to be talking about that, but what's interesting about that is that it's fierce because it's
Mhm,
all set in a kitchen. That's what has happened to her. Her husband has left. She's got 2 kids. She's talking about, the baby crap in the kitchen, the stink of it, she uses those words, I'm not,
mhm.
vulgarizing her, she uses those words, and it's a kind of like a comeuppance to Sappho herself. "Oh, yeah, let's go back to the island of Lesbos and a society of women," and, she had those dreams. She had the dreams of going to London and having her own salon and so on, and then you know, this entanglement with Ted Hughes, this guy that she had typed for
Yeah.
that she had, in a sense, made. And I think I said to you in one of my emails, he actually said to her, as if it were a terrible thing, "You made me a professional."
Right.
Because there's this idea in England of a gentleman. The
Yes.
amateur, who is there's no money grubbing, like these Americans. There's no self-promotion. I'm a gentleman of the poetry world, which is just comical because Ted Hughes was such a ruffian.
Did he not what did he want? Once he became a successful poet, and I do want to, talk about his then being adopted by T.S. Eliot, Stephen
Yeah,
Spender, as kind of the next generation. Is that what he wanted? Was that professionalism, or was that okay?
that was okay because it was T.S. Eliot.
Mhm.
If it had been somebody like William Carlos Williams, probably not. But T.S. Eliot, not only a great poet and, essayist, but, his job was at Faber and Faber, the great English publishing firm, and so on. That was okay. That means you were part of Parnassus. You were part of
Yeah.
the highest, yeah, writing echelon in the world, so to speak. So that part of it was okay, but as Plath says, and Hughes is one of the most unself-aware people I've ever read about. I never met
Mhm,
him, so I can't say I met him, but he doesn't you have to go to her letters to see he is so full of himself
mhm.
that and she says these things and people say, "Oh, maybe she's exaggerating." I doubt it. Essentially, he says things to her, "Why should I limit myself to one woman? I'm great, and all these women are after me." And it was like that before he married her, and then she was gonna be enough. And then
Mhm.
suddenly, for him to tell her she's not enough it goes
Yes.
way,
When
way beyond just husband and wife. It's like it's a direct assault on her identity in a way. "I'm not enough for
Mhm.
you? What? After all we've
Yeah.
been through?"
And
It's
what we're going to be, what we're supposed
and
to
what we're
be.
supposed to be, it's just devastating.
Mhm. So he sort of didn't wanna be a professional, but he took to the fame and glory quite, and
Well, there's
the
that.
ancillary benefits,
Yes,
right?
and when she kicks him out, no problem. He goes to London, and there are all these fawning women, and not just women, men, the critic Alvarez, when Hughes needs a place to sleep, he can just ask, and the door is open. Imagine a woman in Plath's case. She's got 2 kids. She's in Court Green, their country house. She does go to London. She does find her own flat. She does remarkably well, but she's a woman. She can't just, s stand on somebody's doorstep and say, "Let me in," you know?
Yeah.
Not in those days, not in the '60s
Mhm.
for sure, early '60s. So, the fallout from the marriage is much, much harder on her,
Of
than on
course.
him.
Did she regret all that she'd contributed to making him successful?
Well, that's a good question. Never.
Mm,
Even when she reads his love letters to another woman, Asia Wevel,
mhm,
because he's left them behind, very, very
mm.
careless or maybe deliberate, I don't know.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh, she's reading them and it's tearing her apart, and she says, "But he's writing great poetry." She can make that distinction. He is,
Wow.
he is not he's very angry at him, but never, ever does she tear him down as a poet, or does she regret her own part in making him a great poet. That she's very proud of that, and
Mhm,
it would be like attacking herself to say that, well, it wasn't worth it. No, it was worth it. Why can't he see it was worth it? That's what
mhm.
she's asking. Why can't he see? Why can't he see what he's giving up?
Yeah. One of the things I wonder when I think about her, from the perspective of women of a later generation is how because she was so talented and she knew and she did know her own worth, but it wasn't acknowledged in the world the way his was.
Yeah.
When I see there's of well, much reprinted photograph of Eliot and Spender and Ted Hughes at a
Yes.
party at Favors. And there's the account I just looked up of the time that the young the couple, the Hugheses, were invited to dinner at the Elliots' flat, which I must say I picture because I know that flat and, 6 people, that was with the spender, so there was 3 couples, and the little dining room, which is, I think, where the room I think they must have eaten at, which was piled with papers when I knew it, but it's very small, you really couldn't fit more, it would be like even 6 was a bit of a would be a bit of a squeeze, um, but, when Stephen Spender, another poet, kept a diary, Plath wrote about it. I don't know that either of the Elliots ever recorded anything, but when Spender wrote about it, he said, it was Ted Hughes and his wife, an attractive American who also apparently writes poetry,
Yeah.
something like
Yeah.
that. That was in
Yeah.
May 1960,
Yeah.
and
Mm.
would that sort of thing wouldn't that bother her?
It did bother
Didn't sh
her. It bothered her to some extent, but think of for the situation that she's in. This is true earlier in America too when they meet Robert Frost. Robert Frost and Ted Hughes met, I think only once, and they really hit it off, and they're talking a lot and so on. What do you do in a situation like that, where he's won a prize? She has yet to have a book of poetry published. That doesn't happen until
Mhm,
1960 in England. Um, how are you going to be received as some pushy female who's trying to stick her nose in? Later, Alvarez, before he gets to know her really well, visits them once in the country. And he doesn't even recognize her as the Sylvia Plath who he's published in The Observer. She's just Ted Hughes's wife
with the babies
with
and,
the babies and so on.
yeah,
And at that famous meeting, dinner with Elliot, she's pretty quiet.
mm,
And I don't think she's resentful. I don't think it's that. It's just this is Ted's moment. And she's not gonna she didn't say this, but I presume she's not stepping on it. There's I can't find any evidence of any point, in these years when she's, trying to push herself forward when he's, in company with, other people who are interested in him. She
mhm.
never tries to take the attention away from him. She's very proud of him. Um,
She
so
corresponds with Steven Spender after
yeah,
that dinner,
yeah,
which I found very interesting because it seemed rather flirtatious,
mhm,
I think perhaps on both sides, certainly
yeah,
on his it struck me that way.
yeah,
And I think he was quite flexible in his attachments, so
Yeah,
I don't know what was
yeah.
up there.
Yeah, I don't know what was up there either, except I can say that she was, um, even though she was happily married, she certainly found other men attractive and noted, physical characteristics and things like that, and
Mhm.
when men were charming and that sort of thing. And so she was, very much attuned to that. But she's in this male world, that
Mhm.
is, very difficult to crack through. There's a lot of talk about, for instance, Ted praises her poetry, when she beginning around 1960 or so, last 2 years of her life. He's saying things like, "She's as great as Emily Dickinson."
Mhm.
And he can't think of any other poet to compare her to. There aren't any
Uh-huh.
other women as far as he's concerned, there aren't any other women poets who
Uh-huh.
would, measure up. It's always fascinated me that Robert Lowell, even though he was, related to Amy Lowell, always disparaged her. He didn't see her as part of his lineage, as in
Uh-huh.
poetry, as part of the distinguished family. No, she was just this, lesbian, obese poet who happened to have the name Lowell.
Huh. One of the things that I was realizing is how not unique, but certainly unusual Plath was, not just in her talent, but in her aspirations. Um, Valerie Elliott, so T.S. Eliot's much younger wife, obviously at that dinner and cooking dinner, and actually behaving at that dinner probably the way Plath often behaved. They were very close to the same age. Valerie was born in 1926, so they were of the same generation. Um, but how very different, how utterly different they were. And yet at that dinner, I wonder if it would have been really obvious or if Plath would have it said that they didn't the women obviously didn't talk much, I guess, and Elliot didn't talk much. He wasn't very well, or he didn't.
Well, yeah, one of the joys of Plath's life, toward the end is she made friends with an American who was living in England, Ruth Fainlight, who's still alive.
Mhm.
She's 93.
Oh,
And, Ruth wrote a particular poem that had a huge influence on Plath, but they just became friends, and Fainlight was
mhm,
married to the novelist Ellen Sillitoe, and they would visit Ted and, Sylvia, and I think those are one of the instances where there was a level ground, where there
mhm.
wasn't any I always get the impression that Sylvia and Ruth were talking much more than Ted and Ellen were,
Uh-huh,
that
uh-huh,
kind of thing.
because Ruth was also a poet.
She was a poet, yeah,
Yes,
and
and
Sylvia thought she was a very fine poet.
uh-huh,
Um,
so
Same
so
thing
that
with
was a
Anne Sexton. They were in a class
mhm,
together at Boston University, Robert Lowell's class,
mhm,
and there's no bitchiness. There's nothing,
mhm,
sh she thinks that some of Sexton's poetry is, as she says, a little loose, but
mhm,
the influence of Sexton on Plath is clear, and
mhm,
they have a very warm correspondence.
mhm,
And Plath never had a problem with other women who were she was competitive. Adrienne Rich, for example, was a she thought of as a competitor,
uh-huh,
but when they met, they hit it off, they were fine.
mhm. Well, let's then finally, because we can't avoid the subject of
Yeah.
Sylvia Plath's death and the aftermath, because, of course, that aftermath Ted Hughes lived a long time at the aftermath of his wife's death.
Yes, there's lots we don't know about suicide when someone doesn't leave a note or even when they leave a note. Uh, I think there are very mixed motivations in a suicide. Plath was physically ill. Um, we're talking about the early '60s when various, uh, drugs were just being developed to treat people who were, um, having mental problems. She was taking drugs with side effects. One of
Mhm,
them, called Parnate, the side effect of that is chills. So she's having chills in the midst of the most coldest winter on record in England over many, many
mhm,
generations. She's always been a sun worshiper. There are lots of photographs of her sunbathing.
Mhm.
She talks about it all the time. Her mother started putting out in the sun when she was 2 years old. It's associated with health, and England is damp and drizzly, even when it's not that
Yes,
cold.
and it was when it's cold there, it's really
It's
cold.
really cold, and she had no
Mm,
central heating. Um, she she had these 2 young children. They had had the flu. She had lost 20 pounds. She didn't have a phone when she moved in December 1962. She was supposed to get a phone by February. She still didn't have a phone. That was not unusual in the England of that time. She'd have to go out to a call box. The pipes froze. Sometimes she was eating by candlelight because they had power outages. All of this while she was trying to paint this new flat in London, and getting up at 4 in the morning to write her poetry. So she's physically and mentally exhausted. And there are 2 sort of schools here. The El Alvarez school, who says that it just took too much out of her. It just exhausted her, and she couldn't cope anymore. And then eh, they're not mutually exclusive, but there is the exhilaration of writing this great poetry, which is also exhausting, and perhaps the feeling I can't go any further, that I've reached this kind of peak and I can't
mm,
go on. There is the Goethe view in The Sorrows of Werther about idolatrous love. She had made it, and she uses that phrase about Ted Hughes, that she had built him up to be this Superman. And like
mhm,
Marilyn Monroe with Arthur Miller, the woman sooner or later finds out that this guy is not a god, that he's got flaws like everybody else. And she's built him up way, way too high. So there's this crashing fall.
mhm.
So there's this whole complex of factors. The Bell Jar has just been published. It gets a
Perf
good view, gets some good
Mhm.
reviews by Anthony Burgess, for example, who was very
Wow.
prominent at the time.
Yeah, yeah.
He writes a very good review of The Bell Jar. He does it under a pseudonym, though, Victoria
Mhm,
Lucas, because she's drawing on a lot on her own experience, and she thinks the book will upset her mother, and she's right.
mhm.
Her mother
Right.
was very, very upset about The Bell Jar. So if she had, for instance, I believe in contingency. I believe that if you can't walk into the garage and start the car and die through carbon monoxide poisoning, you might put it off for a day or 2, and then something might happen, and you might change your mind. Um, Ruth Fainlight, I mentioned her before as this great
Mhm,
friend of Plath's, had gone to Morocco in the winter of 62, 63, and wasn't
mhm.
there, and was gonna come back to see Plath in March, about a month after Plath killed herself. Uh, Fainlight has said, "What if I had come back sooner?" Um, Plath had tried to reach out to Doris Lessing, who didn't like Plath, thought she was too gushing, too American. She reached out to Stevie Smith, who wrote her a letter. As
Mhm,
far as I can tell, Smith never replied. So, at least at that moment, the idea of a salon, of a supportive
mhm.
network of women was not there.
So she felt very alone.
She felt extremely alone.
Meanwhile,
Uh,
Ted is off with his other
yeah.
women,
And the
which
other thing I wanna add, sort of the sociological
Mhm,
element here, is that winter, more than 200 women gassed themselves in England. People have to forget the idea that there was some essential, urge towards suicide. Plath had tried suicide
mhm,
once before. That's certainly
mhm,
true. But the idea that it was inevitable that she commit
mhm,
suicide, I can't see it. I don't think
mhm,
that's true
mhm.
at all.
And we
Um,
should say that it was relatively easy to gas yourself in an oven at that point. They
Very
changed
easy.
the
You can't do that
Yep,
now. You can't do that in
right.
England now. It
Yeah,
was a
yeah,
different mixture of gas, a different
yeah.
kind of gas. It was called town gas, which
Mhm.
is mainly carbon monoxide, and they just uh, you a woman couldn't put her head in the oven now and do that.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
impossible.
So, yeah. Um, so Sylvia dies. Ted Hughes lived on until, well, for decades. I can't remember when he died, but
Dies in the late 1990s, almost
yeah.
more than 30 years after she died.
Right. So here's the poet who obviously was on a very upward trajectory, and continued. He became then poet laureate. Um, but but who's better known now? Who's as a poet or just in terms of notoriety? What impact
Yeah.
did she
She's
have on who
yeah.
he became?
Well, she's eclipsed him. Uh, because he lived so long, just in terms of quantity, he certainly wrote more than she did. Um, there were at least a couple of poets, who said shortly after she died, this is before she became so famous, who said she surpassed him. She just,
Huh.
surpassed Ted Hughes. And that's a whole other issue of what happens in a marriage when one partner, uh
Mm,
'cause Ted was reading her last poetry. There isn't any poetry of hers. She was still even after they separated, he was
uh-huh.
visiting her in her London flat, and she was reading her poems to him, and he was saying to people, he was writing to people, "These poems are great. These will make her reputation," which is what she thought anyway. She knew it,
And
Ted Hughes knew it, L. Alvarez knew it, and I would say a handful of 4 or 5 other male poets, knew this, and maybe a few women as well.
and when was the peak of his career?
That's hard to say. Um, he went on to write several books of poetry. Um, it's hard to pick out exactly when. It's just sort of cumulative, book
Mhm.
after book. His first 2 or 3 books after Hawk in the Rain, sometimes there's a letdown. In his case, there wasn't. The quality was
Uh-huh.
pretty much as high.
Mhm.
Um, he simply became a kind of cultural figure, um, uh, kinda like Arthur Miller in a way, in that people always associated as they associated Miller with Monroe, they associated Hughes with Plath, so there was always
Mhm.
that sort of lingering tail of flame,
Mhm.
and fame, involved there.
Mhm.
Um, I've
Uh-huh.
read there are only, like, there are a dozen biographies of Plath, there are only 2 or 3 of Hughes,
Mhm.
that could really books that could qualify as
Uh-huh.
biographies. And
Mhm.
I have yet to read one which could pinpoint what you just asked me. What was
Uh-huh.
his peak?
Mhm. I see.
It was a high level of achievement,
Uh-huh.
um, but in some ways, he never just in terms of the greatness of poetry, maybe never exceeded what he did in that first book of prize-winning poetry.
Mhm. Mhm. Feel that that's what one hears about. The 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 Hawk in the Rain is still kind of the emblematic
Yeah,
poem, and then a lot about because, of course, one of the things that happened, because Plath had made no other provision, he ended up at her heir and literary executor,
yeah,
which, I I don't know, I guess she never even thought about it. I mean, that
probably not.
considering how
I've done a lot of
professional she was,
yeah, I've done a lot of
yeah.
reading about depression. And
Mhm,
it's like the way people describe migraines. You have a tunnel vision. William
mhm.
Styron has written about this in Darkness Visible,
Oh,
for example,
uh-huh,
where you simply can't see. It doesn't matter that he won the Pulitzer Prize for a novel or,
uh-huh,
it doesn't matter how much I've encountered this in my work on William Faulkner too. You reach a stage in which you simply can't see beyond your suffering.
uh-huh,
It's like look at Primo Levi. He survived the concentration camps, and then he threw himself down the stairs decades later,
Mhm.
ended his life.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
I think it's, people who, when you look at, um, how suicides occur, it's v to me, anyway, it's very difficult to speak in moral terms about suicide,
Uh-huh.
and blame a person or say a person should have done this or should have done that.
Mhm.
Um, when you look at the contingency, the conditions in
Um,
which the suicide actually lives, those can take over.
yeah. If when Hughes looked, 'cause he ended up being criticized both for what happened to Plath, but also for his control of and editing of her her unpublished work, and so that's one story, but what I wonder about is, if well, you said he wasn't very reflective, but, if he looked back on his life, do you have any sense that he did? And think, what what how did she shape his life? Not just in terms of the weight of her death, but just in terms of her impact on him as a
Well,
poet,
that's
as a
yeah,
man.
that's the
Yeah.
astounding thing about him. He published a book called Birthday Letters, which essentially is his he's not addressing us, he's addressing Plath because he never could get
Mhm,
over her death. And so over decades, so over more than 3 decades, he wrote poems which he finally published, only months before he died.
mhm,
And I think he knew because of the cancer he had that he wasn't going to live. And so it was now or never to publish the book while he was alive. But he didn't face the repercussions. What's astounding about that book is how deterministic it is, about how it's all about how she wasn't capable of surviving. There's absolutely no self-reflection at all about his part in the whole thing. It's to me, it's
oh,
just astounding that someone that brilliant and intelligent could not for a moment really put himself in her place. Uh,
mhm,
he he, uh, he he doesn't say this, but in effect, he absolves himself of all responsibility, which
mhm,
which anyone who's lived a long life, as I have, simply can't believe.
yeah, and, uh, does he did he credit her for when I think about the other course courses that his life might have taken, and this is where I think about this, the fact that she sat there and typed his work. She put her time into making him the poet, the acclaimed poet that he became. Did Was he grateful? Did he really understand that?
He was grateful, when she was typing.
Uh,
He was grateful when they were, collaborating and sharing their poems, going back and forth. He was certainly grateful and felt he even called her his luck.
uh-huh,
He
uh-huh.
understood how valuable she was. None of that gets into birthday letters. In other words,
Oh,
he never after her death, I can't find anything. Jonathan Bate has written a long biography
mhm.
piece. I can't find any acknowledgement of her in that sense at all.
Uh-huh. 'Cause it's one of the things I wonder with this whole idea of thanks for typing and women who have had such an impact. How I tend to think that a lot of the men, it's really become something taken for granted that
Yeah.
there was one there to help them along, that there was an inevitability about that instead of it having been a choice that someone made.
Yeah, you
And
can
that
say she made it easier for him because, she was acknowledging his greatness, so, yeah, he takes it for
yeah.
granted.
And he takes it for granted that he was great, and doesn't think of I mean, so what you have helped me to see is that in spite of all the there's so much around this this pair to see, how impressive a woman she was as well as a poet. How very interesting apart from suicide, but as someone in her generation, her aspirations and her unbelievable determination and confidence um, is I think I'd like to think that would be inspiring for people because that's but and also to think about this the challenge of finding she was looking for a man to her measure and I think she was obviously disappointed with quite how that turned out. Do you have any final um
Well
comments or things
well,
to
my own
urge people to do? Yeah.
yeah, my only, I guess, final thought is that when people think about Plath's suicide, for example, they never think, and I don't think it's in the biographies either. I try to put it into mind how much that suicide is wrapped up in what she did for him. You
Mhm.
know, that people don't it's just about and that's what he does in Birthday Letters. He makes it about her. Of course, it's about her, but, th there's that investment that was made, and
Yes.
the consequence is devastating.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you. Another
Mm,
fascinating conversation. I really appreciate it. And so now you finished the book, your latest on Plath,
yeah.
and what you're writing now is in to go into another book. All right. Well, I'm going to make sure that when we put the show notes together, we'll link to your website and
Okay.
obviously you've there's plenty to read, and I also want to mention because I've been rereading the bit about your chapter about dealing with the Plath or the Hughes folks um, when you were first writing about Plath in your Confessions of a Serial Biographer,
Oh,
which is a
yeah,
book I
yeah.
absolutely love. Okay. Well, lovely to talk to you, Carl.
Yes, thank you, Karen.
Thanks very much. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.